Welcome to Walk Away Wealthy. I'm your host, Alan Terrell Gregory. If you're thinking of selling your existing business or looking to untangle yourself from your old business so you can start a new one, you came to the right place. Today, I have a very special guest, John Kamprath. Welcome to the show, John.
Hey, Alan, it's great to be here. Thanks for doing it.
So, John, let's jump into it. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I am a financial planner and a wealth manager. I have been in this kind of business for almost 20 years and recently launched my own practice called Generational Legacies Wealth Management. And I help business owners have a successful and victorious exit and really get themselves set up for their next act. Been doing stuff like that for the better part of 20 years.
Okay, so how and why did you get started? So let's go back a little bit, helping business owners with retirement.
Yeah, so I kind of got my toe in this when I was working in the legal profession in estate planning and business planning law. There, you just run into so many great entrepreneurs who realize that something's going on with their life or their family, and they need to maybe get their estate plan put together. Then they start thinking about, well, what are going to be some of those next steps as they age and their business matures. Maybe there's family to take over, maybe not. What would be those, action items to really have a successful later period of their lives? And so, just kind of being in that environment for a long time got me pretty excited to want to work actively in it, and that's kind of how it all started.
Nice. So, what are some of the common challenges? I'm sure you know a lot about this that business owners face when thinking about retirement.
Right. Well, how do you extract yourself from the business? So often, especially if it's a closely held business, it's just owned by an owner, maybe the owner and the spouse. The owner often is very active in that business, and has the owner begun to step away, put some key people, in place to help them with the operations, to help them grow the business, to help them with key contracts and that kind of good stuff. If that isn't in place, it's darn near impossible to feel like you can actually walk away, and then you kind of wonder, is this gonna end well, or is it ever gonna end, right? So those are some of the challenges, and then if you've begun to go down that path of distancing yourself from the operations of the business and the ongoing growth of the business, then the question kind of becomes, well, then, who might be buying this, and what would be the terms, and how do I not get bamboozled and come out, drawing kind of the short straw at the end of the process, and not really harvest what I'd like to harvest. So those are some of the challenges that owners face.
So, as an M&A guy, I tell this to everybody, and a lot of people kind of scrunch their face up when I say it. I say, if your business is dependent upon you, you don't have a business, you have a job.
Exactly. And it's like, how do you transform that job into really an enterprise? And we think about enterprise value a lot with businesses. Well, you really don't have an enterprise proper until you stop having a job and you're focused much more on collecting dividends. Obviously, if you're working in the business, you might have to have a salary, and the IRS is going to want to see that you're paying proper taxes. You don't want to push the envelope there too far. But that's one of those very things. In fact, working with your CPA to figure out how can we do that so that it's more of a dividend experience for me than it is, say, a paycheck experience. And that's just key to kind of get that mindset in place. And with that, what I kind of like to do with families is often, one of the spouses is the member that really works so hard in the business. Maybe the other spouse not so much. Well, if we can get both of them to sit together, business owners always want to talk about, how can I drive value? How can this thing become more profitable? And there's all sorts of great tools for them. But if we can engage the other spouse, often that spouse is like, how can we make the family more dynamic and feel like the family is really growing and the business is serving the family? I like to kind of marry those two conversations together when I'm working with a business owner.
So, speaking to family businesses, what sort of exit options do they have? Of course, there's always the third party sale, but what other options do they have as a family business?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially if there's kids involved, or just really interested people. Really, kind of two. One would obviously be a transition to family members. Are typically kids, next generation, maybe even grandkids, depending on kind of where we are in this process. But in all of that, you really need to get get it such that those kids are involved in the business and starting to take on responsibilities, and people not only in the business, that is other coworkers, but also people outside of the business, key contacts, key clients and customers, even suppliers, see that that next generation actually has a leadership role. And how do you mentor them into that? Well, that's a whole process, and it's a wonderful, valuable process to go into. Of course, another whole way is to transition the business to key employees that might not be family members, and that's a whole similar strategy actually to mentoring family members, is that you're mentoring others who are now working inside the business, and it might be a combination of the two. It all depends.
Right. And I was going to say, creatively, it could possibly be one of those things, because if you got a family, some members may want to be part of the business, some of them may not. So then you have to kind of look at your management team as part of that transition as well.
Exactly. And that leads to some really key conversations with the family to set some expectations early on. Because if you've got some kids that want to work it, other kids that really don't want to work it, well, then are the kids just turning into those employees, those, having that job that we talked about before that maybe mom or dad's trying to get out of? And then the other kids are just kind of, collecting a coupon or taking dividend payments, and they're not even working in the business. So you really want to work through those issues and have deep conversations, deep discovery. You want to go into what are the dangers and the opportunities and the strengths laying in front of these people, these kids, and all the parties, and understand, boy, this can work out or it won't work out. And the only way to get there, quite frankly, Alan, is that you got to have a mission. You got to have a vision for this family. Where is the family moving? And how can we all have our own unique goals, for a lifetime? Some would be incorporating that inside the operation of the business, others maybe not. But how can we align them all so that the family mission is something that's held up, that we can all speak to, we can all agree on, but there's different paths to fulfilling that within our lives, but paths that are somewhat harmonious, so that we don't have, begrudged feelings, or feeling like we're hurt, or somebody's working too hard and somebody else is, just getting a bunch of benefit, for not contributing. Those are things that need to be worked through, and that's a great process. But it takes time, just like it takes time to get a business ready for exit, if you're gonna, especially if it's a sale exit.
Right. That leads into the next question I was just going to ask. So would you advise parents to sell the business to their children, or just kind of quote unquote gift it to them?
That really depends. I mean, that's going to be very dependent on the individual situation. So, a sale may make a lot of sense, where maybe there's some sort of a note, retained, and over time that is, fulfilled. Another thing certainly could be a gifting process. That really depends on where the parents, what are their financial needs going forward, for the rest of their life, and what are those plans. But it might be that it's a slow process of gifting, where the parents are still owning and still maybe just drawing more dividends as that business grows over time. And this becomes part of the succession, is really that this is actually a family business, and it is something so that the grandchildren, the great grandchildren are going to begin transitioning into. But you got to be careful how they're structuring that, just from an estate tax, standpoint, and a gift tax standpoint, because you can be gifting things, right now. If you haven't really already, if a family has not, especially a spousal unit, hasn't exhausted their gifting capabilities under the current tax regime, it might make a lot of sense to start looking at transitioning shares of your ownership into some sort of irrevocable trusts for the benefit, of next generations. And there's all kinds of great generation skipping taxes that can be avoided, and dynasties that can be set up, if you will. But you have to work with competent legal counsel. And that's why this whole process of, getting a business ready either for sale or transition to the next generation, we call it the exit planning process. It is a collaborative process. It involves many professionals, and one of those are tax advisors, preferably tax attorneys, certainly CPAs as well, but folks that have specialized in the tax code, and how to do this right, so that you're really setting up the family for long-term success, being compliant, but knowing that we're only going to pay to the government the minimum legally required, not the maximum for failure to plan properly or making mistakes along the way.
And I guess you kind of answered it, because it was something that I was going to ask. You answered it at the tail end of what you were saying. I was going to talk about the tax implications between, gifting and selling the business, which is kind of what you just covered a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so if you're if you're selling the business, there's going to be, some sort of a gain. There are some structures where if you've been a C corp for a long enough period of time, you might be able to avoid some of those federal taxes on the realized capital gain. Again, you want to work with with an accountant, for any kind of qualified small business exemptions there. But that said, there's typically going to be some sort of a tax that needs to be paid if it's a sale. But if we're doing a gift, well, then we could be triggering some sort of a gift tax. And so there are ways to, structure a gift, in the near term, and then maybe over time to minimize the impact of those taxes. And then, of course, you're kind of weighing different tax rates because, if you're actually paying the gift tax, well, the gift tax rates may be quite a bit higher than the capital gains rates. Okay. And you also got to consider within the states, what are your state income taxes, state capital gains taxes, and so forth.
So as CEPAs, for those that are listening, we are both CEPAs, Certified Exit Planning Advisors. Can you talk about the 3 legs of the stool? I'm interested to learn more about that, or at least the listeners are.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Peter Crispin, who was kind of the originator of kind of modern exit planning, if you will, and then the Snyders, Chris and Scott, who kind of took over the business from Peter. Peter came up with this concept of 3 legs to the stool. You can imagine if you want to sit on a stool, you need at least 3 legs, right? Well, what are those 3 legs? That stool is really the rest of your life. That is to be positioned so that you are comfortable and you are stable and you are growing, if not flourishing, for the rest of your days. You need at least 3 things to support that, right? 3 things in particular. So number 1, you've got to do personal planning. That is, what is your next act going to be? What is your vision for your family? What is the vision for your life? And it can't just be, golf and lots of, French wine dinners, like I'm going to be going to one tonight myself with an exited business owner. There's got to be more to it than just the golf and the dinners and the travel. You need to have a purpose, for your life. So personal planning is so very, very important. You got to involve the spouse. You got to involve the next generation, your friends and family, and your trusted advisors. That's number 1. But then number 2 would be your personal financial planning. So the next leg is financial. That is personal financial planning. So you got to run the number. How much do you need to be comfortable, assuming it's kind of an exit and someone else is now running the business? It's somebody else's business. So what do you need to get out of the business if it's just a clean exit sale from that? What is that amount? And can your business supply that? So the whole exit planning process is about, being able to close that gap if there are any, so that you can, sell for what you need. And that's a wonderful, process to kind of go through, because you might discover I could actually grow a lot more value in my business, but I don't want to. Maybe my health's deteriorating. Who knows what it might be? Maybe I can get enough money just to be content where I'm at, and I don't push the value. Or I'd like a lot more value. So you go through the process of growing that. And so that obviously leads into the 3rd leg, which is the business. So it really is related. Your financial needs are one thing, personal financial needs, but then the business. What does the business need to be ready to sell? And again, typically you can capture a lot more value for your business if you work on improving what we call the intangibles. And these are, the capitals within the business, which are the human capitals, your employees, people work for you, your structural capital, those are the processes that you have in place. Social capital, this would be your reputation, and how you are perceived, and your marketing skills, and how you're just positioned within your industry. And then lastly would be your customer capital, and making sure you have a nice diversified customer base, and all the customers don't just depend on you, the business owner, for that relationship, that you're putting other people there. So it's growing all 3 legs of the stool together so that you can, with confidence, say, I am ready to sell, or I am ready to transition to the next generation, or I'm ready to exit, whatever that might be for you.
So you mentioned that you have this dinner coming up with an exited owner. I'm interested to learn, and so are the listeners, how does life change for someone after they exit their business?
Yeah, it's interesting. Life, if you've prepared for the change, you are just incrementally doing more and more of what you were planning on doing. And so the fellow that I'll be with, he put a plan in place. He knew what he wanted to get. He knew that he also wanted to live off of the earnings of the sales proceeds. And he also knew that he has a long bucket list of goals and various activities he wants to accomplish throughout the rest of his life. So all of that was in place, and he was able to move on. It's what I'm afraid of. The danger is if you don't have that planning and that discipline, and you just kind of want to get out and be rich and buy a bunch of stuff. And if you've had the proclivity for living beyond your means, guess what? With a liquidity event of, I don't care what the amount is, Alan, you are going to continue to live essentially beyond your means and always have that fear that I'm going to run out of money, even if it's just an absurd, ridiculous amount of money in your mind compared to where you've been the rest of your life because you've unlocked all this value in your business. You really got to be careful, because then you're just consuming, you're spending. In a certain sense, you're kind of wasting. You have the right to do that, right? In America, it's a free country. You could do whatever you want, but are you going to be happy? And that's the question. You may or may not be so happy.
Yeah, so there's really three parts to this, and I tell this to people as well. So there's the exit planning, there's the liquidity event, and then there's the wealth management. So I want you to dig a little bit deeper and talk to us about the wealth management piece.
Yeah, so wealth management is so very important. I mean, the first thing is you got to we as advisors, and that's kind of where I focus on with so much of my attention with clients, is really understanding what is the client's approach to risk. What does risk mean to them? You have to start with that. What is the maximum drawdown in value? Because when you're running your business, you kind of know if business is good or not so good. But now you got a number, and a lot of that's going to be in liquid investments. And there might be some private equity in there. There might be some direct investing in real estate and private business. But to the extent that you're going to have probably a lot of money that's relatively liquid, and you're getting a monthly statement, and you can go online and drive yourself crazy and take a look on a daily basis. Now you're going to see like fluctuations. So you really have to understand, what is your capacity to deal with drawdowns? And it's great to go back as business owners. You have the advantage of knowing, well, I've been through lots of drawdowns. Maybe I didn't so much worry about the value of my business at the time, although it may have impacted things like my ability to get credit when I needed to extend or renew credit. But you're accustomed to the, if you will, the cycle, okay? And the business cycle and the economic cycle and the market cycles are just even more in your face when you're retired. So you got to have a really good defined sense of, what is my max drawdown capacity to ride through. And it doesn't mean we're not going to be smart and we're going to try to avoid drawdowns. In fact, but it's going to help us understand how much of bad market times do we need to do our best to sidestep, because markets have their worst legs down, worst days, if you will, in big bear markets. They also have their best up days. If you can avoid both, actually, you're going to do great. So it's understanding your appetite for risk and volatility. You got to start with that. That's so very, very important. And then from there, knowing what the limits of risk are, then we can layer on, well, then what are your goals? Okay, how much do you need to generate from a portfolio so that you can feel comfortable and you can achieve the financial spending goals that's going to support all those beautiful things, in your family, and maybe empower next generations to have something as well. But you got to begin with risk. Got to super important to focus on that. And all of this, of course, then is handled inside the context of that financial plan that we talked about earlier as one of those legs of the stool. So when I do some financial planning with folks, it's so important to kind of phase it out. First, you got to do an assessment. Where are you? What does it look like today? Or if you just kind of continue with what you're doing, what's your likelihood of, success, many years from now or through life expectancy? But then from there, then you got to do some design, because there might be some gifting that needs to happen, might be some sophisticated tax planning. We got to design your estate so that your finances will flow appropriately through that and then serve the needs of the family. And then lastly, then we need to kind of implement this thing and put it to work, and design the investment policy statements, and design asset allocations, and all of that in service to, there's a risk tolerance max, and we're not going to violate that.
So how do you feel about risk mitigation in terms of owner financing and retained equity in the business after you exit?
Well, I think it just kind of comes down to diversification, right? So how much of your wealth is locked up in that? So often you'll see maybe 30% is have to be left over, whether it's a note or it's just there'll be a second bite of the apple, and that's fine. The planning process and the risk assessment process that your advisor needs to take you through is to hold that as a real asset and then look at what can go wrong there. Because if things can really go wrong there, then we need other things that will go right when that's going wrong. And we're in a period of time where we've had obscene liquidity pumped into the markets, largely just through government largesse and excessive spending. And so there's just money, 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 money everywhere. Well, what happens if that starts to dry up and that second bite of the apple isn't as tasty as the first one was? And that 30% doesn't become like another 100%, which is so often the promise and often realized. Well, if things start to slow down a little bit and change, then what are we doing to kind of mitigate against that risk?
So here's another question. This is a very interesting question. Everybody's got a different kind of answer to this. How much time is needed to plan and execute a successful exit for a business owner?
That's a great question. And again, it varies on the complexity of the family, what they own, how, who the parties are, and what the communication standard is, if you will, within the family. Because there's some families where there just isn't a lot of, communication. They just kind of like get together for holidays and maybe they text one another once in a while, all the way up to other families where, gosh, there are kids that are already in the business driving value and helping, bring in new clients or helping with even M&A to bring in, buy more businesses to add on to the family. Well, I mean, that's very different poles, and you get everything kind of in between, right? Within that spectrum. So the question is, how much time? Well, generally speaking, anywhere from a year to 3 years is sort of that time frame for getting things right, because there may be things to improve, and a good assessment we can offer you, and many advisors can, like the readiness of the business, for a sale. Well, you go through that assessment that just takes a day or so. Well, then you get that data. Well, this might require some time. It might take a couple of quarters. It might take many quarters, to implement. But then there's also working with the family so that the family's ready for this exit and ready for the next act. So they're not just kind of hit with nice hot water in the face when the sale comes, and I was like, well, now what do I do? So it's probably on the minimum a year, but it could go as long as 2 or 3 years, just depending on the complexity.
So we're going to go rapid fire. We got 5 more questions. The first one is, what does working with you look like?
What does working with me look like? That's a great question. So working with me is going through a process of kind of what we call a deep discovery of the dangers, opportunities, and strengths, not only within the business, but then within the family. So we uncover really everything. And we go through a planning process, like I said, indicated earlier, kind of 3 steps. There's a discovery process. We call it a strategic assessment. There is then we call the family capital plan that we put together, we write together, which comes up with the goals and the vision for the family and what all the specific, pieces of that would look like and what we might need to do with the money in order to support that. And then lastly, we would go through the family capital implementation. All the while, we are also working with the business, and we're working with other advisors to help make sure that business is ready to transition. And we're bringing in all kinds of people like valuation specialists, value growth advisors, estate attorneys, and other transactional people once it comes down to the transaction time, among others. I mean, so it's we put together a team, and I can quarterback that team. Happy to do so. I can also just play on that team, as well. So that's kind of the process, if you will. And then it's just an ongoing process of marrying up the family's enterprise that we're transitioning you into as more of a family enterprise person, and just helping you with that process and driving value through the family.
What characteristics do your best clients exhibit?
That's a really good one. So these are clients that are willing to plan. They're willing to be very honest about personal things, and they're willing to have difficult conversations with other family members. Because often there's just, you uncover some stones, you turn them over, and you realize we got to have a conversation here, and you're willing to have those conversations.
Yeah, and it's they have to be open enough to do it. It's not a one-time conversation. If it's something that's been, around for 10 years, it's going to take more than one conversation to fix it, obviously.
Exactly. And they're clients that are interested in what we call the qualitative aspects of family wealth. And I take this from Jay Hughes, the great attorney, fifth generation estate planning attorney. He's now in the elder days of his life. And he, besides the financial assets, there are actually four other things that are way more important. And so clients willing to have these conversations to examine the human capital within the family, those are the people, the intellectual capital, which would be, all of the processes and stories and ways to solve problems that the family has, and their capacity to learn and then pass on their knowledge to others, their social capital, where they fit within their community, and then lastly, spiritual capital. Not necessarily have to be religious capital, but spiritual, just in that vision, what's important to us, how are we all kind of moving as a family together. Be able to have those conversations, then we can really have success. Otherwise, we can just get to a big number and a big check and have fun spending it. But I'd much rather really help you invest that in the family going forward.
What's your best advice for someone looking to sell their business or transition to a new one?
Assemble a team of advisors, and don't be afraid to spend some money. I mean, in business, you got there's cost of capital, and there's all the other administrative expenses you got to assemble a team that's going to help you through this process. And it's really a team that's looking with one eye at the business and the other eye at the family. And it's all the sorts of professionals that I already mentioned. You got to do that.
And there's opportunity cost too, because if you don't do it, then you got another problem.
You got another problem. You might not sell. You might lose your business. You might get a way lower price tag. So it's gonna more than pay for itself by paying some professionals to help you with it. But it's professionals who know what they're doing. And like Alan and me, we're both CEPAs, certified exit planning advisors. We have a process, a disciplined process that we follow. It's proven, and it really works. And work with a team of guys like us.
What's one of your favorite quotes and why?
One of my favorite quotes, and well, let's see. I have one, and it's Mother Teresa said, sometimes humiliation leads to humility. So there's always times that we fail, right? And the question is, are we going to be humbled by that? Because if we're humbled, we realize we can learn from life that happens, things beyond our control or mistakes we make, either way, right? Can we learn from that and then take the next 2 or 3 steps forward? I think it's a great quote, and I love it.
Okay, last question here is, how can people get in touch with you?
Super. Well, I've got a website, www.gen as in generations. So genlegacies.com. And I can be reached at john@genlegacies.com, or you can call me at 208-299.
Very good.
And I'd love to meet you, and I'd love to meet your other professional advisors that you trust. Thank you.
John, thank you so much for being on. Truly appreciate your time.
This was great. Thanks so very much, Alan. It's great.